Alright, so we're going to be talking about the plasma membrane. This unit is about cell transport, and when I say cell transport, I want you to automatically think about talking about transport in terms of the cell membrane. So we're talking about what's going in and what's going out of the cell membrane. Now, the word plasma membrane is going to pop up just as often as cell membrane, but I want you to remember that those both mean the same things, okay? Alright, so the cell or plasma membrane, which is also referred to as the phospholipid bilayer. All right, and we're going to go into why that is. It's called a phospholipid because that's what makes up the plasma membrane, right? So this structure here, right, the polar phosphate head, which is a water-loving molecule, which is going to be hydrophilic, right? This is a phosphate molecule that makes up the cell membrane, right? So that's going to be the phosphate. They call it a head because if you see down here, it's going to be what's on the very outside. All right. Then you have a nonpolar fatty acid tail, and so these two lines right here are going to be known as fatty acids. All right. So if you see here, those are also known as hydrophobic, right? Water-fearing. So we're going to do a demo of this in class, but it's going to be important that you get this idea here. This is going to be one of our more advanced topics that we talk about. Definitely considering what we've already done. So make sure you're paying attention during this video and while we're in class. But we call it a phospholipid bilayer, right? So lipid, you should remember, means fat, right? So that's why we named the lipid the fatty acid tail, right? These are going to be fatty acids, right? So that's where the lipid comes from. The phospho is going to come from the phosphate head. Right, so if you know the phospholipid, you should be able to remember what it makes up. All right, now it's called a bilayer because if you see down here, this is going to be, this whole structure is the cell membrane, right? It has two layers, and the two layers are the same except they're both going to be, one of them is going to be flipped upside down, right? So these fatty acid tails will always be on the inside, and these phosphate heads are going to be on the outside. Now, when I say polar, right, that means that they have a charge. If I say nonpolar, that means that they have no electrical charge. All right, that's just something you're gonna have to remember. And hopefully, we'll do a demo or a little bit. We'll talk more about that in class to help illustrate that. There's also this point right here. When I say water-loving, right, hydrophilic. Philic means love. Hydro, right, obviously water. These are going to be, they're going to be attracted to the water molecules, right? So they're going to be okay with water being around them. That has to do with the fact that they're polar, and again, we'll address that more in class. These fatty acid tails are hydrophobic, right? So they're water-fearing. They do not like water. Water and them do not mix, right? So in this cell membrane, you have the fatty acid tails that don't like water, and then you have the cell membrane, the phospho heads on the outside that do like water. And that's what's going to give the cell membrane a lot of its interesting characteristics that we're going to go into. All right, so here's one phospholipid, right? One phospholipid. And then on that phospholipid, you can see the phosphate head and then the two fatty acid tails, right? And sticking out of the cell membrane is a carbohydrate right here. Now, that could be anything. It could be cholesterol or anything like that. But you see it's sticking out, right? Here's going to be the outside layer of the cell, and here's going to be the inside. This will all be, the nucleus will be found down here somewhere inside of it, right? The carbohydrates usually sticking out, almost always sticking out towards the outside of the cell, and that has to do with its function. Here we have an integral protein, and again, we'll go more into the functions of those later, but integral means that it's embedded, right? So it's a protein, right? This is made up of proteins, so we call it an integral protein, which means it goes all the way through the cell membrane. This is going to be called peripheral protein, right? It's like your peripheral vision. It's going to be on the adjacent, right, or on the outside, kind of just stuck onto the cell membrane, right? So it's a lot to remember. So feel free to pause the video or replay the video if you need me to go over anything that I just did, if you want to hear that again. Alright, so the plasma membrane. So what we have for the plasma membrane is a fluid mosaic model. Now a mosaic is going to be kind of like a collage, right? It means more like a collage, kind of thing, so it's made up of many different things. We call it a fluid part because it's movable. So the plasma membrane is fluid, right? It's not rigid and unmoving. And that's one of the reasons why we call it a plasma membrane, right? So I don't know if you know anything about plasma, but it's kind of similar to a solid in its chemical structure, but it's going to be very malleable and very almost liquid, right? It's kind of stuck in between that liquid and solid layer. So that's why we call it a plasma membrane, because it's going to be fluid, right? But it's still going to be very structural. It's not going to be concrete like a coffee cup, but it's not going to be completely, you can't go right through it just like any kind of liquid. So like I said, the mosaic part comes from the fact that it's made up of many parts, right? You have the phospholipid heads, the fatty acid tails, you have the carbohydrates here, you have all the proteins embedded in it. The majority of the cell membrane, however, is made up of those phospholipids. And here you see a nice little picture of the inside of the cell being made up of water, the outside being made up of water. You see that the phosphate heads, which are hydrophilic, remember water-loving, are the only thing that come in contact with the water. These hydrophobic fatty acid tails do not come in contact with the water because they do not like water. Here we have another picture of the cell membrane. So here we're also showing some of those filaments of the cytoskeleton, which is one of those organelle systems that we talked about. And you see here how they just provide extra structure for the cell membrane. This picture also shows a better picture of an integral protein or a transmembrane protein. You also have these glycolipids, which will be and an extracellular carbohydrate. So these are all going to be features of the cell membrane. You have the cholesterol, right, which is embedded in the cell membrane in between those phospholipid heads and tails. Those cholesterols help provide some of the flexibility for the cell membrane. Function. What's the function of the cell membrane? So, as you should remember, the main function is to control what goes in or out of the cell in order to maintain homeostasis. So, the cell doesn't want to it wants to maintain homeostasis, right? It wants to keep whatever it has going on in its side of it, wants to keep that at certain levels. So, the cell membrane is going to either regulate stuff coming in or coming out based on what the cell needs. So homeostasis, we should remember, is maintaining a stable internal environment even if the outside changes, right? So if I take a cell out of the water and put it on dry land, we want that cell membrane to contain the water that's inside the cell, right? We don't want it to just all rush out, if at all possible. The plasma membrane is selectively permeable, right? Which means that it only allows certain substances to get through, right? Only certain things can get through. Permeable meaning that stuff can go through. Selectively meaning that only certain things pass the test. So here's just parts of the membrane. The phospholipids, right? This is going to be the main thing right here. The phospholipid, the hydrophilic head, which means water-loving, right? So the water-loving head is the polar phosphate head, right? This guy right here. Then the hydrophobic, right? You have these water-fearing fatty acid tails. And remember, the hydrophobic head, the phosphate head, is going to be polar, and these fatty acid tails are going to be nonpolar. Polar versus nonpolar, like I said, we're going to talk more about that in class, and hopefully we have a demo that's going to better illustrate that. Cholesterol. So when I say steroids, I don't want you to think like muscle head or anything like that. A steroid is going to be anything extra kind of in your body. So cholesterol can even be a steroid, right? Cholesterol is something that, like I said before, it keeps the membrane fluid, right? If the temperature is too hot, the membrane doesn't fall apart because it has a cholesterol. And if the temperature is too cold, it won't freeze up because it has the cholesterol. And that's just a part of the chemical structure of cholesterol that allows for it to do that. So it keeps the membrane from ever getting too fluidy if it gets really hot, and it prevents it from freezing up, hopefully, if it ever gets too cold, which are very useful for our cells, obviously. Then we're talking about two different types of proteins, right? I already mentioned them, but the integral protein is going to be protein that goes all the way through the cell membrane, and it's going to be there to transport different things. So these are integral proteins, and like the other picture we had referred to them as transmembrane proteins. You should probably remember both words, but they're going to act as channels, right? So this protein will usually fit whatever it would be. So let's say that this is a protein channel for glucose. It's going to be the same size as glucose, and it will allow glucose to transverse this cell membrane. Glucose is going to be normally a molecule that's too big, but if the glucose runs into this protein channel, it would allow the glucose to enter the cell. The peripheral protein is going to be a protein that's on the edge of the membrane, and those are going to be proteins that receive signals. So let's say that this would be on the inside of the cell. Let's say the cell wants to talk, it needs to tell its membrane, it'll have some kind of mechanism that would allow the cell to know that we need more salt in the inside of the cell. We just need it for whatever we're doing inside. We need to allow more cholesterol to enter. So then these would receive that signal, and then maybe this would be a transmembrane protein and allow the cholesterol to enter. So remember, peripheral proteins are on the outside or the edge, and they're going to allow signals to be received. Integral proteins are going to be proteins that go all the way through. Then you have your carbohydrates. Your carbohydrates are going to act as a tag, and they kind of identify a cell. So a good example of this is going to be blood types, right? So you probably heard, maybe you have AB, or A blood type, or O blood type, AB blood type, and maybe you have O negative, right? The negative part is going to be another part of chemistry, or another part of biology that we're not going to talk about right now. But what it means to have blood type A or blood type B or blood type AB, right? If I say blood type A, that means you have a tag, right? You have carbohydrates on the top of on the outside layer of your blood cells. And that tag, that carbohydrate, is going to say that this is an A blood type. Right, so it's going to be here, right? This glycolipid or this carbohydrate chain, those are going to say this is an A-type blood cell. And that's why they say when you get a blood donation, you have to have the same blood type. If I have blood type A and all my blood cells have this A tag, and I try to get blood type B, blood, my body will read the tag on this blood type B and recognize it as foreign, and foreign things to the body are bad. That's how we protect against infections and diseases. So that blood type B is going to get destroyed by my body in order to try to protect me, right? Because my body doesn't know any better. So that's what it means when they say you have blood type AB or AB or 0, right? Or O, excuse me. All right, so this is going to be a matching thing. We're going to go over this in class. You don't have to do this part. Save this for class. We want to go over it with you guys. Again, I covered a lot of parts of this video, and this unit is going to be probably a bit more complicated than our last one. So make sure you watch the video, if you need to. Make sure you write down any questions that you have and bring them to class. And remember that this video will be up here anytime you need to rewatch it if you think you need to maybe refresh your memory before the test.